Okay, so we're continuing the theme of Lechem Mishneh, the obligation to have 2 loaves of bread at the meals on Shabbos. Just 2 things to follow up from what we mentioned last time before we go into the new material. We spoke about asmachta. That means that we saw that the Gemara, the simple reading of the Gemara would seem to indicate that the obligation to have 2 loaves of Lechem Mishneh on Shabbos is the Raisa, is a biblical obligation. And we saw that the Taz indeed quotes that, halacha l'maisa, that if you have limited resources, then it's more important to get Lechem Mishneh than candle, if for Shabbos of Hanukkah, than the candles of Hanukkah, because biblical, he says it's a biblical obligation. And we saw that the Mogen Avraham seems to suggest otherwise, and most poskim take on that way. And many Achronim say that the Taz doesn't actually literally mean that it's biblical. It just means that because it has some reference in the Torah in about asmachta, it's called an asmachta. We mentioned this, so therefore it takes precedence. Anyway, so I mentioned this concept of asmachta, which literally means support. That it's a rabbinic institution that they find support for in the pasuk, which is an allusion, often a very vague allusion. Not illusion, but allusion, an allusion to it. And so I remember there's a Ritva, where the Ritva writes that, God forbid to say that that the Asmachtas, there are those who argue on the Ritva, but this is the Ritva, he says this very emphatically, that God forbid to say that the Asmachtas are completely, in truth, unrelated. The Chachamim just made it up. And they quote unquote, blamed it or just found an association to the pasuk, but that actually the truth is that Hashem initiated it in a vague way, and he left it up to the Chachamim to actually solidify it and choose whether or not they're going to solidify it or how they're going to solidify it. But that Ritva claims very strongly that it's something that even if it's an asmachta, and so in terms of halacha, we don't treat it as a rabbinic mitzvah, we don't treat it as a biblical mitzvah. Nevertheless, it does have, let's say, biblical underpinnings. Okay, I just thought that's interesting to mention. Now, what we finished off with last week was the halacha that's mentioned in the Shulchan Aruch Siman Kuf Samach Zayin, which is the laws of Mathias Harpas. This is not in the specific. This is not unique to Shabbos. This is every day. That whenever you say the bracha hamoitzi, you're supposed to hold the bread with 10 fingers. Why 10 fingers? So it says because there's 10 mitzvahs that you do with bread. In the preparation of bread, there are 10 mitzvahs involved. One is, and we went through that one of them is bikurim, bringing the first fruit. And so there's 10 mitzvahs, not to plow with an ox and a donkey together, not to plant mixed seeds, to leave the gifts to the poor from the field, etc., etc. One of the 10 was the mitzvah of bikurim, to bring the first fruit, and that's why you hold the bread with 10 fingers. So we asked the question, what about if you're having spelt bread or oats or whatever it is? You also have to hold the bread with 10 fingers, because first fruit are brought only from the Shivas Aminim. What are the Shivas Aminim? The 7 species which Eretz Yisrael is praised for, and of which is 5 fruit, and then the 2 grains of chita and sa'ira, wheat and barley. So if I'm having spelt bread, then spelt is not one of the 7 species, so then there's no 10 mitzvahs. So in fact, I think that that's what we ended up with last week, but I think in fact it's not true, for 2 reasons. First of all, because there are different opinions in the Rishonim. The Gemara says that the 5 types of grain, we have chita, sa'ira, kusmin, shebel shul, and shifer, which are wheat, barley, oats, rye, and spelt. So the halacha is that spelt is considered in the family of wheat, and rye and oats are in the family of barley. Now, again, I don't know what that means scientifically, And there's actually a lot of discussion of recent if actually Shabbat Shul is what we call oats, or perhaps it's something else. But be that as it may, halachically, spelt is considered in the family of wheat, and Shabbat Shul and Shifain, which will translate as oats and rye, are in the family of barley. Now, one of the areas where this has halachic relevance nowadays, for example, just parenthetically, is if you're making doughs. Let's say if a woman's making challah and she has one batch of wheat challah that she makes and one batch of spelt challah or oat challah that she makes. So there's different, the way they can you separate challah from what, can you separate challah from one of those doughs for both of them? So it depends on a number of different factors. It depends how big the doughs are, there's a number, and it depends what species they are, but it's complicated. Like spelt could mix with any of them, but wheat can't only mix with spelt. But there's all these different combinations that are listed in Shulchan Aruch. For those learning to be Prakim of Rambam, we learned it a few days ago, whatever it is. So that's the practical relevance nowadays. But Akaponim, back to our case and point, is that according to some Rishonim, specifically according to Tosfos, the Tosfos and Psachim, where the way the Maharsha explains the Tosfos, it's the first Tosfos in Daf Lamed Vav with Beis Psachim. The way the Maharsha understands that Tosfos and also other Rishonim over there is that we take this to the extreme. That as far as all things are concerned, we consider spelt to be an offshoot of wheat, and so the mitzvah of bikurim, according to that opinion, would apply to spelt. And so according to that opinion in the Rishonim, then even the spelt you would have this idea of to hold it with 10 fingers. Additionally, the Beis Yosef in Simkov Samach Zayin, when he brings this halacha, so he brings an alternative reading of the list of 10. And instead of bikurim, he removes bikurim, and instead of bikurim, he adds in the mitzvah of lisachsim shoy b'dishoy, not to muzzle the animal when you're plowing or threshing with it. So according to him, so really it turns out there's 11 mitzvahs. So I don't know why we choose 10 out of those 11 and not the whatever it is. But the truth is that even when you're dealing with spelt, even if you want to follow the opinions that spelt are not actually considered part type of wheat, and that we don't bring bikurim from spelt, you still have 10 mitzvahs with spelt if you count not muzzling the ox during the threshing process as one of the 10. Anyway, all right, moving on. There is a Gemara. Okay, what do you do if you don't have 2 whole loaves? Actually, it happened. Somebody was talking to a shliach this past Sunday. We were on the bus together at the Kiddush HaShluchim, and he said that Shabbos afternoon he has a newly married daughter who lives in Crown Heights, and Shabbos afternoon he went to her house for the meal, but he came late, and it seems he didn't make up clearly exact arrangements before Shabbos. And by the time he came, they didn't have any Lechem Mishneh left, right? There's a newly married couple. You don't have a stock pantry necessarily. They have 2 loaves to Lechem Mishneh, and that's it. He came, they missed it. So what do you do? so actually, we already discussed last week about using mezainos. Yeah, maybe if you kaveh suda, if you take cake and you eat enough cake, you have to eat a lot of cake to be able to wash on it. You eat enough cake anyway. But so there's an interesting parallel. So during the week, by the way, there's also an idea that you're supposed to make a bracha on a whole loaf, if possible. But there it's sort of, if you have the option, in other words, you're about to make a mitzvah, you have a choice to make from this loaf or from this loaf. Take the whole loaf, because it's always a good idea to make a bracha on the whole thing. And it's not just a loaf, it's any fruit. If you have if there's a choice to make a bracha on a slice of apple or on a whole apple, you make a bracha on a whole apple, right? But on Shabbos, there's a specific thing that we're going to go for kikar shalim, for actually 2 complete loaves. So there is another area of halacha where you need a kikar shalim. A whole kikar means loaf, shalim means complete. You need a complete loaf, and that is eruvin. In eruvin, again, so nowadays this is sort of unfamiliar to most of us, because even if we use the eruv, we don't get busy with it. Whoever's the committee that takes care of the eruv, and your average layman has nothing to do with an eruv usually nowadays. But originally, the way the eruv worked, let's talk about an eruv in a chutzner, which means you had a courtyard, a foyer sort of courtyard, and a number of houses opened into this courtyard. So the courtyard is surrounded by a wall. It's not open, but it's still public in the fact that all the residents of those houses, you have 10 families. Each of those 10 families have equal rights to playing basketball in that area. And so we're not allowed to carry in that area unless you make an Eruv. An Eruv doesn't mean the wall, there is a wall around it. An Eruv, literally, the word Eruv in this case means to mix. We're going to mix up these 10 houses and combine them. Maybe combining is a better word, to mix and combine. To combine these 10 families. How do we combine them? They all give a loaf of bread. And let's say, families 1 through 10, families 1 through 9 are going to give a loaf of bread and put it all in a basket. And that basket of 9 loaves of bread is going to be housed in house number 10. And in his house, he's going to have this big basket which has the loaf of each of those families. And then that's the way of saying, we're all one happy family. We share one pantry. And once they become one unit, so now it's not considered a public domain anymore. It's a private domain. It's one unit, one family using this courtyard. And then the kids can go and play basketball in the courtyard. It's actually not 100% accurate because you are allowed to carry in the courtyard or even without an Eruv. You just wouldn't be allowed to take something from the house into the courtyard. So something that was in the courtyard already, you could carry around, but you wouldn't, if you had your basketball in your house, you couldn't take it outside. Yeah, but it's not really, it's sort of quasi-public, so that's why this mechanism works. So one of the rules so we said it has to be a loaf of bread. One of the rules are that it has to be a kikar shalim. Why does it have to be a kikar shalim? Because we don't want to get what's called ava. We don't want it to get into this bickering. Look, I gave more than you. I gave a nice bukavidik loaf, and you just gave some stale bagel from Friday. so apropos, right? So therefore, in order to avoid this type of bickering, so therefore the Mishneh says that it has to be a kikar shalim. It has to be a complete loaf. And so the poskim bring, and that's as far as Eruv is concerned.
We're going by that theory, then. The here has to have like 200,000 loaves of bread.
Yes. So first, there's a few things. First of all, here the mechanism they use here is not really Eruv v'chatzer, it's shutufei mevois, which is a little bit different. But the primary answer to your question is that that's only when you have a certain amount, less than, I forget exactly how many people. Once you have more than a certain amount of people, then you need to have 18 Gregorus, which is, they have probably 2 boxes of matzah, and that's, there's a certain cap that you don't have to go beyond. But presumably, yeah.
And what, they keep it in somebody's house?
No, they keep it, well, I don't know where they keep it in Chicago, but yeah, there's a place where it is. You can find out. You can go and eat it. You're allowed to go and eat it. If you come and eat it and somebody tells you no, you call the whole Eruv into question. It belongs to everybody.
My guess is they keep it at the CRC or something like that.
Yeah, I know in Edgware, where I lived for a number of years, there's the rabbi of one of the shuls there who sort of initiated the Eruv project. When now Eruv Edgware is a booming film city, but when he started it, there wasn't. But so in his shul on the wall, there's a big case. It's a see-through case. Everybody could see it. Tie up. There's 2 boxes of machine matzahs, and every Pesach they change it. I don't know if the times the Chassidim can carry an Edra because they hold up machine matzahs and chametz, so it's a problem.
And then it's chametz shavar afterwards.
Exactly. All right. So in Winston Towers, when I lived in Winston Towers, I made an Eruv.
How many loaves of bread?
I took a box of matzah.
For the whole?
Yeah. A big one, 2-pound box of matzah.
Building?
Yeah, for the whole building. I did all the things. When I left the building, most of the people in the building use the Eruvs. They don't use the city Eruvs. They don't care about it. There was one person in the building who cared about it that I knew of when I left the building, and I gave it over to him. And does he still live there, Davidi?
Davidi's there, yeah.
Yeah, so I think,
right? Yeah.
So he still has it.
I don't know if his father's also mafia, maybe.
I don't think so.
No. Okay.
All right. So it's brought in Shulchan Aruch. So what do you do if you don't have a loaf? So this is actually not brought in Lechem Mishneh. I'm going to read you here from the Alter Rebbe in Simukuf Sameches, which is technically not Shabbos. It's the laws of Mathias Harpas during the week, but it mentions there about Shabbos. So I'm going to read you from the English translation. It's in Untitled Chapter, chapter Kuf Samachas 168, Sif Gimel number 3. If a person has 2 half loaves of bread but lacks a whole loaf with which to fulfill the obligation of 2 whole loaves on Shabbos, he should join them together with a piece of wood that is considered a kli, or with another article that is not muktzah in a manner that their attachment is not apparent. This loaf is right, so you somehow stick them together. You take a toothpick and you stick them together so that they're held together so that it looks whole. Now, when it comes, and then he adds that you have to make sure something that's not muktzah. You can't just take a piece of wood off the fence because that would be muktzah. But if you have something that's a kli, for example, a toothpick, that's a useful thing, that's not muktzah, so then you could use that to hold the 2 loaves together. This loaf is considered a whole, as whole with regard to the obligation of 2 whole loaves, just as it is considered as a whole with regard as a whole loaf with regards to Erev Chatzeris. Right? So just
even if they weren't separated from the same loaf, but if you have 2 half loaves and 1 loaf, put 2 half loaves together, that makes 1.
I don't think they have to have originally been one. They have to now give the appearance of being a whole loaf. I mean, it's going to be most easy if you have 1 loaf that was cut in half.
Take like a half a bagel and a half a loaf of bread.
No, because then it doesn't look whole. The idea is that it has to look whole. Right. Now listen to this. If a person, however, a person has a whole loaf, he may not rely on this ploy, for it could be said that such a loaf is considered as whole only with regard to Erev Chatzeris. For in that instant, a whole loaf was required only to avoid strife, i.e. lest one homeowner complain that I gave a whole loaf while you only gave a slice. As long as the joining pieces is not apparent, there is no need for concern. In other words, if the reason why you need a whole loaf is for Erev Chatzeris, where there's no intrinsic need for a whole loaf. The intrinsic need is that everybody gives food. Once everybody's given food, you have a shared pantry, you consider it like 1 unit. Then there's an additional law that you have to give a whole loaf, so that there shouldn't be strife. So as long as it looks whole, nobody's going to complain because nobody's going to notice that it's not a whole loaf. But with regards to the 2 loaves on Shabbos, by contrast, where it could be said that joining pieces are not considered as a whole loaf, just as joining them in this manner doesn't cause them to be considered as 1 loaf with regards to ritual impurity and purity, right? So we're not going to get into all the laws of Tumah and Tara, but there are differences in those laws between a whole loaf and a partial loaf. And nobody's going to say that if you take a whole loaf and 2 half loaves and you put them together with a toothpick, that is going to suddenly attain the status of a whole loaf with regards to purity and impurity. So therefore, you should only rely on that if you don't have an option. So you don't just take 2 half of challah. If you're stuck, you don't have Lechem Mishneh, but you have 2 half of a loaf that you can give the appearance of a whole loaf, then that's okay. Now, and then the Alter Rebbe finishes that in the weekday you don't need to do it, because in the weekday the whole idea of making the bracha on the whole loaf it's a good thing to do. If you have a whole loaf, if you don't have a whole loaf, you don't. So don't make yourself crazy to put the toothpick together to put them as a whole loaf. The truth is that it's brought in Shmir Shams Kil Chasam, that on the weekday there's another idea, and that is well, the truth is, you could do this ahead of time for Shabbos. So if you have half a loaf, he says that if you put it in the oven again and you rebake it a little bit, so it gets a bit toasty, but now it's like it's, I'm reading to you from Shmir Shabbos Kol Chasam, volume 2, chapter 55, number 10. He says you could put it back in the oven, and that's how it has a bit of a Lechem Shalim. And he quotes Challah Shechuvas Shali Tzir. Excuse my ignorance, I'm not sure who that is. And he says that would be better than combining it through a toothpick. If you realize before Shabbos that this is a situation, to take that half a loaf and stick it in the oven. Now, this can be very useful on Pesach, because on Pesach, and what do you get? You shmur matzah, and some years we get lucky, and some years we get a whole bunch of broken up pieces. So now here, so if you take the matzah and you stick it in the oven and you bake it again and you toast it again, so he says that's considered a whole loaf. Yeah. I'm not sure if it's permissible to do that on Yom Tiv, because on Yom Tiv, you could do it on Chalamayah before Pesach, and also if you're makbid on Gebroks, you want to be careful about getting crumbs into your oven, so that might not be such a recommended idea anyway. But I'm not sure, because on Yom Tiv you're allowed to cook and bake something that's a tzorich eichel nefesh for food. Here you're not doing it because you need the food. You have the food. You want it to be a whole thing. I'm not sure. I'm not saying you're not. I'm not sure if it would be permissible to do that on Yom Tov. It would be permissible on Chalamayit or before Pesach. I'm not sure if it would be permissible to do it on Yom Tov. By the first time, nothing to do with halacha. I actually do another thing. I put matzah in a 9x13 pan, and I put it on the blech, and it makes it taste fresher. It's like toasting it, Today I don't worry about gebrux because it's in the pan, it's contained, and it's not, it's not. Anyway, now what about? So now there's another thing. There is the poskim bring echad b'memches, and again, this sometimes is relevant on Shabbos, but it's more commonly relevant on Pesach. The Gemara says, and I thought I prepared the source, but I don't see it, so I'll have to say what I remember from memory. The Gemara says that Hafrashas Challah, the Challah of a Nachtim, which is Echad b'memches, doesn't disqualify the bread from the Eruv. I'll explain what that means. Remember, we said when you're doing the Eruv, everybody has to give a whole loaf. Now, when you make challah, when you make bread, so you have to be mafresh challah. You have to take off. Mafresh challah, the mitzvah of mafresh challah. How much do you have to be mafresh? So the isas nachtoim, it says the balabayis has to do echad michav daled, 1/24 of the loaf, and nachtem has to do one less. It's 1/48 of the loaf. And nowadays that is going to streifa, so everybody could do 1/48. Okay, so practically speaking, we say it's 1/48 of the loaf of the dough goes to challah. Now, if you didn't take off the challah when it was dough and you bake the bread, then you have to take it off to when it's already baked. I just had this in my house. I mentioned before, my wife recently made challah and she made wheat and spelt. And she was mafresh challah from the wheat, and then afterwards I realized that in that scenario, based on the exact quantities, etc., she had to have mafresh separately from the wheat and separately from the spelt. So then we took a piece of the spelt challah, and we said there is a challah, and that's the freshest challah.
They're mixed together?
No, if it's mixed together in one dough, then it's fine. But if it's two separate doughs that she just touched together, you mafresh challah like you do. Usually, if you have two big doughs of wheat, you touch them together, or you put them in one bowl, or you touch them together, you cover them. There's different ways of.
Put them together in order to take them one.
Yeah, so that works if it's wheat and wheat. If it's wheat and spelt, there's a lot of variables in that case. So if it's wheat and spelt, there's two variables. One variable is which two species are they, and there's all different combinations. But wheat and spelt combine only if each of them don't have their own shir challah. But if there's enough wheat on its own to be mafresh challah and enough spelt on its own to be mafresh challah, then you have to take separately from both. Anyway. So the Gemara says that if there's 1/48 missing from the challah that you give for the eruv, it's okay. Why is it okay? Because it's hafrashas challah. Now here we have a machlokes rishonim, machlokes between the Rosh and the Ri. The Rosh says that that's only. I'm quoting the names of the 1 second. Let me just make sure I'm quoting them correctly. Yeah, sorry. The Ri says, the Ri is quoted by Torah. He says what that means is if you give your challah, you're going to give your challah for the eruv, and then you remember that you weren't mafresh challah from this challah, so then you mafresh challah, and you take off 1/48 of the loaf, and even though now you're not giving a complete loaf, it doesn't matter because why not? Because again, the reason you have to give a complete loaf is because of Eva, so there shouldn't be strife, there shouldn't be bickering. Here, nobody's going to bicker. Everybody's going to know you had to be mafresh challah, so nobody's going to feel like you're being cheap and taking advantage of them. Everybody will understand that you had to be mafresh challah from your dough. That's the way the Ri explains it. The Rosh says no. The Rosh says even if this wasn't full of challah, even if you already mafresh challah from this thing, but because that amount of 1/48 of the bread is the amount that you are mafresh challah, so b'meila that's not an amount that people are going to be makbid on. And therefore, you have a loaf of bread, a piece of it broke off. If not for hafrashas challah, a piece broke off. But if that piece is 1/48 of the loaf or less, then you could still use that for the eruv. Now,
you could take the challah that you're mafresh and use it.
Not the challah that you're mafresh. Okay, again, you have a piece of bread.
Yeah.
1/48 of it is missing. In other words, like this. The Re says, the Re holds, you have a piece of bread, you forgot to be mafresh challah. Be mafresh challah, take off 1/48 of it, and then give it to the Eruv, it's fine. The Rosh says, no. Even if you weren't mafresh challah from it, now you're already mafresh challah, it was fine. Stamazol, a piece that was a 48th of it broke off. Nevertheless, you could still use it for the Eruv. Why? Because had you forgotten to be mafresh challah, you would be mafresh challah, and that's how much would be missing, and it would be fine. So even if you were mafresh challah, and the reason this 48th is missing is stam because it fell off, it's still fine for the eruv. Is that clear?
Mm-hmm. I think so.
It doesn't sound so complicated to me.
No, I don't. I'm just making. You can after you bake after you baked it, you can take off and use that for
no.
You're being mafresh after it's been baked, right? You have already bread, and then
you're mafresh as baked, and that you give to the kohen or you burn it. Okay. The rest of it, that's a complete loaf minus a 48. You can use as the challah.
That was what I didn't know.
Right?
Okay, that's what I didn't
know. Yeah.
So what are you giving? What are you giving?
Talk to me. Hold on. What's who's good at math over here? What's the 48th in percentage? 1/48 in percent is 2%. Okay, it's basically 2.08, right? So if you have, basically what we're saying is like this. According to, again, we're not talking about Lechem Mishneh, we're talking about Eruv. The laws of Eruv. If you have a loaf that is 97.02% complete, according to the Rosh, you could use that for an Eruv. 97, let's call it 98. Sorry, it's 97.80, 82.82. Let's just call it 98. Let's call it 98. If you have a loaf which is 98% complete, according to the Rosh, you can use that for the Eruv. According to the Re, you can only use it for the Eruv if the reason why you're missing 2% is because you were mafresh it for Challah. Right. Now, what's all this got to do with Lechem Mishneh? The Mishneh says that when you use an Eruv, you have to have a kikar shalim, you have to have a complete loaf. Comes the Gemara and says that if you're missing 2%, according to the way the Rosh understands the Gemara, it's fine. Come dice that a loaf that's missing 2%, the Mishneh refers to as a complete loaf. And therefore comes again the Rosh and says that it's also a loaf complete for Lechem Mishneh.
How big does the loaf have to be to begin with?
2% is 2%, it doesn't matter.
No.
It has to be, I think it has to be kazayas.
So it could be a roll.
Yeah. So if you have a roll that's missing 2%, if you have a roll like that big that's missing 2%, according to the Rosh, again, it's interesting because the reason for Eruv wouldn't apply to Lechem Mishneh. The reason for Eruv is because people are going to bicker and going to be offended if you're using less. So if it's only 2%, nobody's going to bicker. That's irrelevant to Shabbos. For Shabbos, the reason you need a whole loaf is not because people are going to fight. The reason you need a whole loaf is because that's for Kavod Shabbos, whatever the reason is. But nevertheless, because the Mishneh refers to the loaf of Eruv as specifically being a complete loaf, and the Gemara says, according to the Rosh's understanding of the Gemara, that 2% is missing is fine. Kundois that a loaf that's missing 2% is halachically considered a complete loaf, and you could use it for Lechem Mishneh. 1 second. Halacha l'maisa, we only rely on this. If you don't have another option, but if you do have another option, we say no. That's only as far as Eruv is concerned. It doesn't apply to Shabbos. But again, when does this become very relevant? It could happen. It could happen anytime. In fact, it happened to me recently. I was somewhere where there was a challah which the challah flopped a little bit, and what happened was basically I don't know exactly what the recipe was and what happened to it, but the crust of the challah wasn't really crust. It was just regular bread, and it was a bit moist because it was painted over with egg. And when they took it out of the Ziploc bag that it was in, the crust sort of all crumbled apart. So is this loaf still considered a whole loaf for Lechem Mishneh? So I think it's so safe to assume that the amount that fell off was less than 2%. According to the Rosh, it was for sure fine.
It stuck to the bag, and then when you pulled it out,
we mentioned also last week. When you say Lechem Mishneh, even though we mentioned last week the Mishnah Berurah, the chumrah of the chidah and the gra to cut both loaves. But the ma'aseh the halacha is, and the widespread custom is that you only eat from one of the loaves. But nevertheless, ideally, you should have both loaves unwrapped, so not one in a bag on your cell phone. You should have both loaves open, and you should ideally. Anyway, I think you mentioned that last week.
But I would assume that there's some disagreement with the Rosh on this, right?
Yeah, because the Re holds that it's only, you can't be missing 2%. The Re holds only if the 2% that's missing is because you forgot, right? Again, the halacha is if you forget to be mafresh challah before you bake it, you mafresh challah after you bake it. So the Re says if you took this challah, you're about to give it to the air, but then you remember, it wasn't mafresh challah, so you mafresh challah right then, and that doesn't matter. Not that any 2% doesn't matter. 2% that you actually were mafresh challah. Yeah, again, we're using the word challah here in two connotations, so it could be a bit confusing, right? Challah means, we call the loaf bread, colloquially we call it challah, and then the word challah halachically means the challah that you designate, that you separate and designate as the mitzvah of taking your part of the dough and giving it to the kohen. Nowadays, we usually burn it, whatever it is. Okay. So I just want to say, this is very relevant on Pesach, because often on Pesach, if the shipment didn't go so smooth, so you have your matzahs which are completely in crumbs. You have 3 whole matzahs, and then most of your matzahs are whole, but there's somewhere in the edge there's a little tiny piece missing, right? So ideally, you look for the matzahs that are completely complete. But if you've ran out of those and you have matzahs that are just missing a small piece at the end, so if it's less than 2%, then less 2% of the matzah, then according to the Rosh, according to they bring the Shah brings it from the Chacham Tzvi, whatever the pasuk talk about it, that you could that you could use that for Lechem Mishneh. Again, the Rosh doesn't explicitly, he's not talking about Lechem Mishneh. 1 second, but the pasuk say that according to the Rosh that would work out fine. Yes.
Can you use murah matzah to make bracha that has a crack?
If it has a crack but it's still attached, then it's certainly fine.
Oh, it's okay.
Yeah.
I always try to avoid having even a piece of it.
It could be that's an extra hiddur to have it completely complete. I'll tell you, you know what? You're actually leading on to the next sub Lechem Mishneh, which I'm going to. Ari, you wanted to ask something?
I'm just wondering. There must be, besides the sheet of the Re, but even within the Rosh, that is a shalim only in terms of Ava, right?
Yeah,
they're calling it that, but they're calling that within the context of that don't lead to Ava.
Right. But
I can imagine you could quibble with that.
Of course you could. Yeah. But nevertheless,
of course, according to the Re.
Yeah, no, even 100%. It's not so pashut. But that's what the pasuk say that because the Mishneh says that kikar shalim, it's fine. Okay. So there's a minhag. I'm sure you've noticed. There's a minhag before you say Lechem Mishneh. People make a little mark on the bread with a knife. What's that all about?
Yeah.
So first we have to know what the halach is in the weekday, and then we'll say what the halach is on Shabbos. Aaron, you're being cool. I don't see you and I don't hear you, so I assume you understand everything. There's no questions. No.
Yep, I'm an expert.
You don't disagree with anything I've said so far, huh?
No, I mean it's very interesting.
Okay, good.
I'm trying to grasp all of it. I'm not sure that I have all of the foundations to understand a lot of the stuff that's going on. So I'm trying to get what I can.
Feel free to butt in and ask for extra clarification. Okay. So what's this scratching the challah with a knife all about? So during the week, so it's like this. There's an idea that between the bracha of Hamaitzi and when you eat the challah should be as little interruption as possible. So during the week, you're supposed to slice. So if you're making a bracha, and ideally you make a bracha on a whole loaf, you're supposed to slice it almost all the way to the bottom. Now, let's say and like this, you still have a whole loaf because it's still attached, but you're not going to waste 5 minutes slicing your bread because you've already sliced it before. How much are you supposed to slice it? So you're supposed to slice it enough, as much as you can, but leaving it attached enough that if you would pick it up from the small section, the big section would come along with it, right? So if you cut it, I don't know, imagine an average challah, if you cut it 2/3 of the way, right? No, yeah, probably. Depends on the consistency and how big the slice is, etc. But let's say if you cut it 2/3 of the way, if you pick it up from the small side, the big side will come along with it. It won't crack off, right? Let's say. But if you cut it, more than that, 3/4 or whatever, yeah, then you're going to pick it up it's going to crack. So that's how much you're supposed to do it during the week. Again, nowadays, it's not so, it's a less practiced halacha because, first of all, we have sliced bread. You can do it that everything else in this world is the best thing since sliced bread. So sliced bread is the best thing. Even when you don't have sliced bread, you're using a bagel. So the way you eat the bagel, it depends how you're eating it. You're eating it as a sandwich. So then, bichlal is a question to have sandwiches, whatever. Yeah, you're not supposed to take a bite out of a piece that's more than a kibbeh, whatever. There's different shyness about that. But whatever the case is, if you ever look at Yidden who are makbid in halacha, you'll see that that's how they do it. They slice the bread almost. If you go to a weekday suda where you have a lot, you go to a bris, you go to a sheva brachas, when you have a wedding where you have a big challah. Yeah, if you ever go to a wedding and they come there, they have this huge challah like this, and the photographer comes there. So if the chassan knows what he's doing, that's how he'll do it. He'll slice it open as much, half of the way, I think. Then he'll say the bracha, then he'll finish slicing. Yeah. And it depends also, you do from the middle, you do from the side. That's the halach. Yeah. So on Shabbos, you're not supposed to do that. Why are you not supposed to do it on Shabbos? So Shulchan Aruch, I think it's the Ramah. Again, I don't remember the source right now, but I'm pretty sure it's the Ramah. Says that the reason is because on Shabbos you need Lechem Mishneh. Because on Shabbos you need Lechem Mishneh, so therefore you shouldn't do it. So one second. So you could understand that to mean that for Lechem Mishneh you need to have a whole loaf, and a crack in the loaf would be a problem for Lechem Mishneh, and there's no do it. But when Alter Rebbe says it, and again Alter Rebbe is in the laws of Mathias Harpas and Siman Kuf Samach Zayin 167. So there it says, and again I'll read this from the translation in English. One second. Before, again, this is not about Shabbos, this is during the week, yeah? Before beginning the blessing, it is desirable to make a slight cut with a knife where one will slice the piece of bread from the loaf to minimize the delay caused by cutting, so that it will not be considered an interruption between the recitation of the bracha and the eating. Should not separate the slice from the loaf until he concludes the entire bracha. Making a small cut as this type does not cause the bread to be considered a slice, as long as the entire loaf will not break off, but instead be lifted up when the sliced portion is lifted. Should not slice more than this amount, for if he will slice the loaf in a manner that when he grasps the piece, the entire loaf will not be lifted up, even though were he to grasp the loaf, the piece would be lifted up with it. It is considered as sliced in all contexts, right? So even though if you would pick up the big piece, the small piece, the slice would come along with it, we need it to be that if you pick up the slice, the big piece would come with it. Yeah, maybe it's not 2/3, maybe it's half. Hold on. That's during the week. With this in mind, on Shabbos and Yom Tov, one should not cut the bread at all until after the recitation of the bracha. Why? So I thought it was going to say, because we want it to be whole. He says, no, because maybe your hand will slip and he will cut more than this measure, causing him to break on the sliced loaf, and it is obligatory on Shabbos and Yom Tov to say the bracha for 2 whole loaves. And the way the Alter Rebbe is learning Pshat is that the problem is that you might forget. If on Shabbos, if I tell you to slice it halfway, you might by mistake slice it 3/4 of the way, and then it's going to be too much. So if that happens on the weekday, it doesn't matter, because on the weekday, it's not the end of the world if you don't make the bracha on a whole loaf. But on Shabbos, where there's, quote, an absolute obligation to say the bracha on a whole loaf, I can't allow you to cut it halfway, even though cutting halfway, or like Mark said, having a crack in the mouth, so it's still considered whole. The problem is you might come and do it more by mistake. Yeah?
At what point is it not considered a Challah?
Where the part that if you will lift up the slice, the rest of the loaf would break off. Then he says, on Shabbos, one need not be concerned that the ensuing delay in cutting the bread causes an interruption between the recitation of the bracha and the eating, because merely waiting without speaking is not considered an interruption. It is only that during the week one should conduct himself in the above manner. Okay. Nevertheless, if one forgot on Shabbos and Yom Tov and sliced the bread as he does during the week, he does not forfeit the mitzvah to use 2 loaves as long as it's still the entire loaf, as long as it's still attached enough that the entire loaf would come up when you pick up the slice. That's the halacha in Shulchan Aruch. One second, I want to finish. Is there something that's not understood? Okay. Now,
Just like, what's the reason for the cutting in the first place? Right?
The reason for the cutting in the first place is so that there should be no interruption in between the bracha. In between the bracha.
Save some time from after you set the bracha.
Exactly. Now, part of the time, quote, wasted is you need to look for the right place where you're going to cut. You need to choose. Oh, well, you need to cut from the best part of the loaf, the part of the loaf that's the most baked. So then there became a minhag. The Mathias Shekel brings this. The minhag became that you make a little mark on the bread. You're not allowed to cut it because we're scared you're going to cut it too much. You make a little scratch. A little scratch is fine. What do you accomplish by doing the scratch?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Oh,
Make the scratch.
so yeah, the way the minhag on Shabbos is not even to make an eighth of an inch. Mamish a tiny, just a mark. It's just enough to be a mark. It's a mark that you see where the knife was. So what's the reason for it? So the Mathias Shekel brings that. Let me see. Here. Sorry, the Magen Avraham brings it. The Magen Avraham brings them in it. And the Mathias Shekel explains that the reason is because, so first of all, he says different. He says that on Shabbos you can't start to cut it because you need it to be complete b'shas the bracha, right? It doesn't say like Alter Rebbe says because you might come and cut it more. He's learning that if it's cut, it's a problem. So according to Mathias Shekel, if you have a matzah with a crack in it, it would be a problem. According to Alter Rebbe, it's fine. Then he says, what's the point of making a mark? Because we want as much as possible to minimize the interruption between the bracha and eating. And therefore, if you have the mark, then after the bracha, you won't need to take the time to think after the bracha, okay, where should I slice this bread from? Because already you've done that before the bracha. Before the bracha, you look, oh, here's the best part of the bread. I'm going to make a mark. That's where I'm going to cut from. And like this, as soon as you finish the bracha, bam, you're straight into action, right? So that's what. And he says the Mathias Shekel, the loy minhag ha'amonim, not like the minhag of the masses, that they just sort of wave the knife around the challah and they don't actually make a mark. You have to make a mark. Because if you're not making a mark, then there's no point in the thing. Now, this is Mathias Shekel explaining that to the minhag of the Magen Avraham. The Magen Avraham says this. Nevertheless, yeah, the lashon of the Magen Avraham is hamedaktakim noyagim lushin besakim kodim abracha. That's the lashon of the Magen Avraham. The Alter Rebbe doesn't bring it. It's very strange, yeah. For those of us following the halacha, the Alter Rebbe is a Magen Avraham. The Alter Rebbe usually the Alter Rebbe brings a Magen Avraham. The Alter Rebbe doesn't bring it at all. So if you would just read the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, on the weekday, you slice it, let's say half or 2/3 of the way. On the Shabbos, you don't touch the knife to the loaf before the bracha. However, in Ksei Shulchan, we've discussed the Ksei Shulchan many times. Rabbi Chaim Noah, very prominent Pesach and Chabad Rav in Eretz Yisrael. So he and his work has very recently been reprinted in a new typeset, which is very easy to read from, not like this one. And so he says that like this. Says the Alter Rebbe doesn't bring this in Shulchan Aruch, which seems to imply that there's no need for this mark with the knife. Nevertheless, the minhag is to do it. However, I heard from my grandfather, Hagoy Nachos and Ramoshe Tzvi Noyer Harav Mikalisk. So Rabbi Chaim Noyer's grandfather, Ramoshe Tzvi Noyer, was the Rav in a city called Kalisk, and he said that he heard from the Tzemach Tzedek, and the Tzemach Tzedek was talking about something. I don't remember what he was talking about. Chaim Noah doesn't remember what the topic of the conversation was. But in the topic of conversation, the Tzemach Tzedek was talking about people who do chumras or do things which are unnecessary. And the Tzemach Tzedek sort of mentioned in passing that somebody who does X, Y, and Z, again, Chaim Noah saying, I don't remember what X, Y, and Z was, is comparable to the people who, after they make the bracha hamaitzi, they're looking, oh, where was the mark? I need to cut in that exact place. And he says, so the minhag is taka to touch the knife, you make a little scratch, but he says, don't The point is that you've looked for where you want to cut the bread, so you don't need to cut that exact millimeter. You made okay. I'm going to cut this side of the bread is baked better. I like challahs that are baked well, so I'm going to cut it on the top third. So the top third. You don't need to look for your scratch to do it again. Okay, so that's.
He didn't say that making the scratch, which is not mentioned by Shulchan Aruch.
No, he didn't say that making the scratch is in the shagas.
That's not considered.
The mishagas is looking for your scratch to make sure the knife isn't exactly in the spot of the scratch.
And actually, I mean, that is more delaying, if anything.
Yeah. All right.
Nobody's saying there are some people that are looking around. Where did I make that scratch again?
All right. It's already. You make the scratch. Yeah, that's the minute. You make the scratch. But you don't cut. Don't cut. Just a slight mark. Yeah. All right. Okay, one more important thing, l'chayra. Two more important things which we haven't yet covered, I think, is how to hold the challah, and the challahs, and how to hold the challahs, and also being mitzi other people. So, so we're holding it with 10 fingers. We know that already. So in Shulchan Aruch, the Shulchan Aruch Mechaber brings that the way to hold the challahs, it depends. It's Friday night and Shabbos day. Right? It says so it goes like this. The Mechaber says in Shulchan Aruch that you hold them both in your hands and you make the bracha on the bottom one. So he's imagining you're holding them two like this, one on top of the other, and then you say the bracha on the bottom one. Says the Rambam that's only on Friday night. But on Shabbos day or on Yom Tov night, you make a bracha on the top one. And the Rambam finishes off, Hatam al Derech HaKabbalah, the reason is for a mystical reason, I'll pick Kabbalah. Now here, the Poskim get very upset about this, because there's a concept of Ein Ma'avirin Ala Mitzvahs. Ein Ma'avirin Ala Mitzvahs means you can't overpass a mitzvah. You have to do the mitzvah which you encounter first. So for example, an everyday example of this is, it's brought in Shulchan Aruch that when you put away your talis and tefillin, you should put your talis on top of the tefillin, so that when you come the next morning, the first thing you encounter is a talis, because you're supposed to put on the talis first, because talis is an everyday mitzvah, and tefillin is only a weekday mitzvah. So something which is more often is done first. The talis has to be put on before the tefillin, but also you don't want to encounter the tefillin first. So therefore, you put it away in such a way that you encounter the talis first. Similarly, within the tefillin themselves, you're supposed to put the talis on top. The talis is on top in a way that you encounter the talis. Similarly, with the tefillin themselves, which tefillin do you put on first? First the hand tefillin, then the head tefillin. So you're supposed to put it away in a way that the next morning you're going to encounter the hand tefillin before the head tefillin. You don't want to encounter the head tefillin and say, I'm going to put this aside and put on the hand. So similarly here, says the Bach, how could you tell me that you make the bracha on the bottom loaf? You have to make the bracha on the loaf you encounter first. The top loaf. Yeah. So what are we going to do about this? So there's three answers to this question brought in the Paskim. One answer is, and the Aruch HaShulchan brings this, that the idea that you have to do the mitzvah you encounter first is only if you intend to do both of them. So you come in the morning, you intend to put on talis and you intend to put on tefillin. So you do the mitzvah that you encounter first. That's why you have to orchestrate it such that you're going to encounter your talis before your tefillin. But if you're not planning to do both, let's say you only want to put on tefillin and you're not interested in putting on a talis right now, so then you don't say that you're passing over a mitzvah. Similarly, we mentioned last week that you only cut one of the loaves, right? So Mela says that it's no problem Ma'avirin Ala Mitzvahs, because I only want one loaf. I want the bottom loaf. If you're going to cut both loaves, so then you could say, okay, Ma'avirin Ala Mitzvahs. But if I'm only planning to cut one of them, so I don't want to cut. I'm not passing over the top loaf. I don't want to cut the top loaf. I'm keeping that for tomorrow. I specifically want the bottom loaf, so it's not a problem. Al Kupanim, not everybody accepts. He brings a raya from Mathias, that not everybody accepts the Baruch HaShulchan. And the halacha, there's two other workarounds, and the Alter Rebbe, I believe, brings both of them. Number one is that you switch them around. That means that you put, how does he say? Hold on. What's that?
When you go to cut it, you put the Harpas down. And then the one you're going to cut, you cut it. Right?
Yeah, so the Magen Avraham says, so he says, you take the top, you want to use the top loaf because they have mitzvahs. So you put the top loaf, you have one on top. Then you take it's like that placed on the table for Kiddush. Then when it comes to make hamotzi, you switch it around and you put the top one on the bottom. But because that one was on the top, so that's considered a Mavira Mitzvahs. That's what the Magen Avraham says. And the Taz says something which would seem much more logical. And he says, I put the bottom one closer to me. So you imagine, the top one and the bottom one is this way. So the top one is on top, but the bottom one is closer to me. So I'm going to encounter the bottom one first. And that way it's fine. So according to the Taz, and this is, I believe, outside of Chabad, this is common practice, that on Friday night, you put one on top of the other, but the bottom one is closer toward me, and that way I make the bracha on the bottom one, and I don't have a problem with Mavirin on the mitzvahs. And Shabbos day, you just do the top one, and that's it. However, the Rabbi brings in the letters that in the Chabad there's a different minhag of how to do it, and basically, he says we don't put one on top of the other, we do them next to each other. It's applicable. We do them next to each other, and we do them with the bottom facing each other, so that all you could see is the top of the challah, the face of the challah, and the bottoms are facing each other. And he says Friday night you do it like, imagine these are the loaves, so the top of them at my hands is the top of the loaves, and my palms are the bottom. So Friday night you do it like this, you put them together this way, and Shabbos day the bottom one, the one on the right. So again, I'm doing this on my right, the one on the right is a little bit raised over the bottom one. And now the Rabbi doesn't say, according to this minhag, which one you cut. Yeah. Now Friday night, there's no bottom and top one, so cut either of them, I guess. I don't know. And Shabbos day, cut the right one. I've always had a problem how to. And is this minhag? One second. Is this minhag an exclusion to the minhag of Shulchan Aruch? That's what it says over here. Now, what's the reason for this minhag? So it's brought over here, and they bring over here two quotes from Alter Rebbe L'Kutei Torah, which seem to be relevant. One is he talks about, I'll just go over very briefly because it's sort of this in the deep mystical stuff, but he talks about two methods of Seder Hishtalshelus. One is where there's sort of cause and effect, Ilu Alu, and one is where he calls it, I think he says, that everything is Hiskalulus, everything is combined together. And on Shabbos, that's how it works. So therefore, on Alpin Nigla, he says you're supposed to have one on top of the other, because that's the normal approach of cause and effect, and one thing leading to the next. But Alpi Kabbalah, Shabbos is such a level of Hiskalulus where all the different levels come together, and mainly you're supposed to hold the challahs not one on top of the other, but one next to each other. That's one thing. And that's in the Maimer in Parshas B'Shalach, in Torah. And then in L'Kutei Torah, in Parshas Eikev, he's talking about also Shabbos, and he talks about the Lechem HaPanim and Panim V'Acher, and he says that's why the Lechem HaPanim was Kulei Panim. Not sure exactly what that means, that there was no back of the Lechem HaPanim, and it's called the Lechem HaPanim, the showbread in the Beis HaMikdash is called the showbread or the face bread, because it's all the front, it's all the face. And he says that, and so B'Meila, that's also why he says Al Pi Kabbalah, when you make Lechem Mishneh, you're supposed to conceal the back of the challah so that all you should see is the front of the challah. So that's Pashas, the reason why our minhag is when we say Lechem Mishneh to put the backs together, so we do it in that way. Yes?
You have two challahs like this. So what I do is I make the straight right. Pick it up, make the bracha. Take the one on my left hand, put it down. And I cut the one on the right.
So that's the Chabad minhag, yes. Right, that's right. Yeah. Okay. Yes. One more topic, which we'll go through quickly. We actually discussed this before, I think. But anyway, so the simple reading of the Shulchan Aruch and the Mishneh Berurah says this clearly, and it's almost explicit in Alter Rebbe also, is that basically one of two things. Either every individual at the table has their own two loaves to make Lechem Mishneh on, or the Balabos, the Balabai says Hametzi, and he discharges everybody their obligation of saying Hametzi, and then they have a piece of his challah, and they don't and they don't. Nobody says their own bracha hamaitzi. They're yotza, and they're yotza two things from the balabais. They're yotza the mitzvah of Lechem Mishneh because he made the bracha on 2 loaves, and they're also yotza the bracha of hamaitzi. So they just take the bread, they eat without a bracha. They heard his bracha, right? That's what the Mishneh Berurah says. That seems to be the implication of the Alter Rebbe, and that is certainly outside of Chabad. That is the widespread custom. Yes, that's exactly. And he has to wait. The balabas has to wait for everybody to finish washing and be back at the table before he says hamaitzi. Right. Now there is a sefer with. Hold on. There is a sefer, a famous sefer we've discussed it many times. The Eshel Avram, the B'chach Rav, a very prominent pesach who often has very original ideas. And again, I often think that if it wasn't him saying them, we would never give it the time of day. But he says it, and he's So the Eshel Avram says no. He says there's 2 separate things. There's a mitzvah to be beitzei on Lechem Mishneh, to break bread over 2 loaves. By the way, the Eshel Avram doesn't say this, but as the mitzvah, the concept of Peres Mapa Mekadosh, yeah, if you're having a meal on Friday and going into Shabbos, so how do you do Lechem Mishneh? You just break 2 loaves of bread. You don't say hamaitzi. You've already said hamaitzi. Right? So that the balabas does b'shlichus of everybody else on everybody's behalf, and then there's the bracha of hamaitzi. And B'meila the Eshel Avram says that even if I'm not yotz to the bracha of hamaitzi from the balabas, and even if I haven't washed yet, if I hear him saying hamaitzi on Lechem Mishneh, I fulfill my obligation of Lechem Mishneh. And there's a letter of the Rebbe where somebody asked him about Minch Chabad. The Rebbe quotes the Shel Avram, and this sort of became the de facto Minch Chabad. And there's two takeaways. First takeaway is that according to this Shel Avram, according to Minch Chabad, everybody does say their own bracha hamaitzi. I don't rely on being yotza hamaitzi from the balabas. The balabas because in the Challah I make my own bracha hamaitzi. And nevertheless, I'm still yotza Lechem Mishneh from the balabas. That's chiddush number 1. And the Bible of it is, it could take a long time from when he says, I'm going to till I eat, so it could be a long hefsek. Maybe I didn't listen to every word. It could be other miles. And additionally, what this means is that I could have not washed yet, and probably I could have even not made kiddush yet, right? And so what happens is, if you have limited Lechem Mishneh, if you have only 1 set of Lechem Mishneh, so waiting time is never a good idea. But it's just like you're supposed to, as much as possible, juxtapose the bracha of hamaitzi to the eating. You're also supposed to juxtapose as much as possible the eating to the kiddush, right? So if the balabas makes kiddush and then he washes and then he's waiting for 5 minutes for everybody to make hamaitzi, that's not ideal. What's more ideal is make kiddush, wash, say hamaitzi, and everybody else could still be making kiddush, washing, and then they come to the table and the yotze of him is Lechem Mishneh. Now, if your wife is going to like it like that, it might not be offensive to the guest or whatever. I don't know. We have to see. But at least halachically, according to the Eshel Avram, that's fine, as long as the balabas made the bracha over 2 loaves of bread, and I heard him do so. Even if I was in the kitchen or I was still by the sink washing, I heard from the dining room. He said hamaitzi loud, and I could hear him from the kitchen. I'm going to the mitzvah of Lechem Mishneh, and that comes down to tremendous. Practically, it's a tremendous. It's very practical, and to rely on the.
Anyone has to make sure to make hamaitzi.
Anyone has to make their own hamaitzi, yes. Well, the balabas could have in mind that whoever wants to be yotzam yotz, whoever wants to make their own is make their own. So if you're eating at my table and you rely on my hamaitzi, that's fine.
My worry is that people are going to think that because they're yotzei Lechem Mishneh, that somehow they're going to be yotzei the bracha too. If they haven't washed yet. You know? Oh, so Shlomo Zalman brings up the that's okay, as long as there's no interruption besides washing. He says, if okay. Yeah, he says, we'll finish with this, that I'm pretty sure that's Shlomo Zalman, just a second.
The same thing applies to fellow students?
Yes.
Okay. But what if you have a student during the week? Do you still use 2?
No, only 1. He says here, Hamavarich birchas hamaitzi. You listening, Ari? Hamavarich birchas hamaitzi mechav lahitzi samasum gam mechaya. But the Eved him yotzi de chayve gam madayin leberch birchas al natila tzadaim al natila. ידיים לנגבס ידיהם ובלבד שיהיה נאמין. ואפילו אם עוד לא הספיקו ליטל ידיים, גם אז בדיעבד יוצאו ידי חובה. לא, המוציא. ובלבד שיכוונו לברכת המבורך ויהיה נאמין, ולא יפסיקו בשום דבר אחר מלבד נטילת ידיים עד שיתמו מן הלחם. Because no matter what hamotzi. So again, this is okay, I don't know all the resources, but this is the Shmir Shabbos Kalachasa. That's what he brings. That v'diavad, that would be okay too. All right, we'll stop here. All right, have a good day, Aaron. Have a good week.
Thanks, you too.